Okay, hello everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. This is Mark Bollinger with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm joined today by my colleague and co-author Joachim Seal, and together we will walk you through the highlights of the 2018 edition of our utility scale solar report, which was released just last week. Before we jump in, I do want to note just a few things. First, we will save some time for questions towards the end of the hour, so please do feel free to type your questions into the chat or Q&A box at any time during the webinar, and we'll do our best to get through as many as we can. That same chat box is probably also the best way to let us know if you're having any technical difficulties, as at least one of us, either Yo or I, will be monitoring chat throughout the presentation. Finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within a few days. So this is the sixth year that we've done this report. And I want to just quickly mention that this year we decided to change the naming convention in an attempt to make it easier for readers to identify the latest edition. So instead of calling this year's report Utility Scale Solar 2017, which would have followed the old naming convention, we are instead referring to this year's report as the 2018 edition of Utility Scale Solar. And then next year, will be the 2019 edition and so on. So just wanted to throw that out there to try and avoid any confusion. And we would like to thank the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office for funding this work. So with that out of the way, the premise behind this annual report series is that the utility scale solar market in the U.S. has been growing rapidly, generating a large and increasing amount of empirical project level data that is ripe for analysis. So what Yo and I do every year is to gather up as much of that project level data as we can and then analyze it in a variety of different ways with the goal of identifying key trends in things like project design, technology specifications, geographic location of projects, installed project prices, O&M costs, capacity factors, and PPA prices, among other things. And we'll touch on all of those things today with a primary focus on, or really an exclusive focus on, utility scale photovoltaics, or PV. The report itself does cover concentrating solar thermal power, or CSP, as well, and we'd be happy to talk about CSP during the Q&A portion, but for the main part of the presentation, we're going to focus exclusively on PV. So before we dig into the project level data and analysis, let's just talk a bit about deployment trends as a way to set the stage. So here we see the deployment history of solar in the U.S. going back to 2007, along with projections out through 2023 from GTM and SEIA. Utility scale solar, which is shown here in blue for PV and orange for CSP, has been the largest segment of the overall U.S. market since 2012 and is expected to remain so through at least 2023, with somewhere between 6 and 8 gigawatts of new capacity added every year during that period. Here's another way of looking at historical solar deployment, in this case placed within the context of additions of all different types of generating capacity to the U.S. grid. So in 2017, solar was the second largest source of new capacity added to the grid, accounting for 31% of all new capacity, with the utility scale sector alone accounting for more than half of that, or in other words, 17% of all new capacity. In addition, 2017 was the 5th year in a row in which solar contributed more than a quarter of all new capacity added to the grid. As a result, a number of states now exceed 10% solar penetration, with California even higher than that at about 15%. The numbers do vary a bit, and the relative state rankings shift around a bit, depending on whether you calculate solar penetration as a percentage of in-state generation or instead as a percentage of in-state load. But in general, these are the top 10 states in the U.S. in terms of solar penetration, shown in the table here. The relative contributions of utility scale versus distributed solar also varies from state to state. So for example, most of Hawaii's solar penetration comes from distributed solar, whereas most of Nevada's comes from utility scale. So with that bit of context, I will now hand it off to my colleague, Joachim Seal, who will take you through our project sample and then discuss upfront installed project prices. But before I do that, I do just want to clarify that when we're compiling our project sample and gathering empirical data, we focus only on ground-mounted projects that are larger than 5 megawatts of AC capacity. So just about everything you'll see from here on out will adhere to that definition of utility scale, which again is ground-mounted and more than 5 megawatts. For those of you who are interested in smaller projects or roof-mounted projects, Berkeley Lab does have a companion report series called Tracking the Sun, the latest edition of which was just released yesterday, and you can find that on our website. So with that, let me hand it over to Yo, and then I'll be back a little bit later in the webinar. Yo, take it away.
Thank you, Mark, for this great introduction. It's now my pleasure to talk a little bit more about some technology trends and upfront capital cost trends and O&M, operation and maintenance cost trends for utility scale PV. And so before I really dive into that, here's just a brief presentation of our sample and the projects that came online over the past couple of years. We have had in 2017 about 146 projects in our sample. Overall, since the inception of our report series and since 2007, we have about 590 projects totaling nearly 20 gigawatts AC. And what this graph shows here in the bars is the main distinction really here in the color scheme. Tracking is in red and fixed tilt is in blue, and it's measured here by the project capacity size. You can really see this big dominance of tracking projects that we've had over the past couple of years, really starting in 2015 and then growing in the dominance every year until 2017. And so when we talk about tracking projects, we mean primarily single-axis tracking projects where the modules can track the sun from the east in the morning to the west in the evening, and thereby boosting overall generation over the course of the year. We have nearly 80% of all newly installed capacity has a single tracking mechanism, and in terms of overall projects, about 70% of all new projects. So clear dominance here. The second distinction that we have in this graph between the light shaded and dark shaded colors is the module technology type. So the predominant module technology type are crystalline silicon modules, and the lighter ones here are thin film modules, primarily cadmium telluride modules. And those cadmium telluride modules primarily are built out by the company First Solar, whereas there are a variety of manufacturers of those crystalline silicon modules, and we don't have exact manufacturing information for all of our projects, but within our sample at least, Jinko Solar had the biggest lead, followed by Hanwha, Trina, Canadian Solar, Mission Solar Energy, and finally SunPower. And of all those crystalline silicon modules have clear hold of the market as well, with nearly 75% of the newly installed projects, or 83% of the newly installed projects. So this is just an overview of the two basic types of technology. One area which, of course, many people are interested in is the addition of storage to utility scale PV projects. In our sample, we've not really had a whole lot of those, still primarily in the planning phase or among new projects that are going to come online in the year 2018 and further on. And Mark will dive into that later a little bit more. I would now like to shift the focus a little bit towards the geographic footprint of new projects that came online in the year 2017. And the red bar at the very bottom is California. California has historically really been the leader in terms of new project capacity, but since the year 2014, really, its relative market share has declined each year. So more and more projects have been built out outside of the traditional strongholds of California and then later on the Southwest, so that in 2017, California only accounted for 20% of all projects. However, among all the states, no other state has built out more capacity than California in the year 2017. What's also interesting here, and what we've seen in the past graph already, is this big difference between 2016 and 2017. 2016 had many projects coming online due to the perceived end of the ITC back in the days, which, as many of you know, has been extended since then, but that contributed to this big rush. So the capacity in our sample has gone down quite a bit. In terms of project numbers, we only have seen actually a small decline from about 160 projects to 145 projects or so. So still relatively similar project sample there. What is really like the big driver of new capacity and new growth in the United States is Texas and the Southeast. Texas has nearly doubled its capacity additions from last year, and is now the second largest state in terms of new additions with 650 megawatts. And the Southeast, the blue bar here, really shined in 2017. North Carolina is a well-established player in the utility-scale solar market. Traditionally, many projects there were rather small, about 5 megawatts, due to the PPA legislation and the size restrictions there. But we now in 2017 saw 20 projects coming online there in the range from 10 to 80 megawatts, so really building out a lot of capacity. And Virginia, South Carolina, and Florida also built out a lot. Last, we've seen a couple of new states with the first utility-scale PV installations larger than 5 megawatts AC, and that's Michigan, Missouri, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. Now this slide here really represents the same information, just a little different with a map. The color scaling there in the back is a measure of solar resource, the annual global horizontal irradiance, and the darker it is, the more solar resource you have. You see that the Southwest and California in particular, have really strong solar resources, so you get the most bang for your buck for any module that you install there in comparison to, for example, the Northeast. The new states are marked here with the red circles. And what's interesting to see as you look at the map with Texas, Southwest, California, and Northwest really has predominantly these green diamonds, and those symbolize tracking projects, whereas fixed-tilt installations are primarily now really in the northeastern part of the United States, where there is less sun available. Also interesting, Hawaii had for its first time a tracking project. Traditionally, they have to confront higher component costs over there, and this year was the first one where they built out a tracking project. Now, this is the map with all the installations, not just the new installations in the year 2017, but all the projects that have come online since the year 2007. And again, we see now that utility-scale PV has really spread throughout the country. The coast and the Southwest is really well represented. The only region where we do not see a whole lot yet is the western Midwest, what we also call the wind belt, where we just have really strong wind resources and a lot of wind capacity. And there were few policy drivers or regulatory requirements that would really mandate a strong build-out of utility-scale PV. So at least historically, we've not seen a whole lot there yet. With that, I want to dive a little bit deeper into this build-out of utility-scale solar in regions that have less sun. So one measure of that is this annual global horizontal irradiance value, and the green bars here represent the median solar resource among all the projects that came online in a particular year. So the median solar resource has really decreased since the maximum in 2014 to now about 4.7 kilowatt hours per square meter per day. And the red dots and bars represent tracking PV. The blue triangles represent fixed tilt installation. And what you see really is that the tracking projects expand their range more and more. In the beginning, they were really just in the very high solar resources, and now push more and more into the lower solar resource regions as well, whereas fixed tilt installations are increasingly retreating towards lower solar resource areas. And all else equal, of course, if you have on average less sun available, that would mean that on average, on per unit basis, we would also have less solar generation, at least all else equal. A second design trend that we find interesting is the so-called inverter loading ratio, which describes the DC capacity relative of the module arrays relative to the AC capacity of the inverters. And so over the past years, module prices have come down a lot, and developers have found it advantageous to oversize the module arrays, and that enables them then to generate more electricity during times when the solar modules would not deliver full power relative to their rated capacity. So in the spring or in the fall or in the early morning hours or afternoon hours, if you overbuild your DC module capacity relative to the AC capacity of your inverter, you just have a less peaky generation profile and broader shoulders, and can overall maximize more generation. So that has been a trend that has been increasing year over year to now about 32% more modules relative to the AC capacity. It's important, however, to realize that there is broad underlying heterogeneity of different design practices. Some projects are pretty closely aligned, have just maybe 6% more modules relative to the inverter capacity, whereas others really have increased their module arrays much more than 60% more than the inverter capacity. And especially if we go into a future where we will have more storage that is DC coupled directly to the modules, one could make the argument that those storage units could then absorb some of the energy that would otherwise be clipped during peak times, and that would then enable an even higher inverter loading ratio. Some people use to up to maybe 1.9 even. So all else equals, a higher inverter loading ratio should really boost the capacity factor, just because you have, at least in AC terms, because you would have more generation during the day. And we'll get back to that a little later. And now I'd like to focus on upfront capital costs or capital prices. And what we describe here are the transaction prices between two independent parties, for example, a developer and then a later owner. And we do not yet include any kind of upfront incentives, such as the investment tax credit or accelerated depreciation schedules, which in reality bring the all-in cost for the owner down a little bit. And we have gotten data from a variety of sources. We've done interviews with developers. We use SEC financial filings. We use regulatory filings in front of POCs. And so that's where we get our data from for historical years. We also get data from the EIA that is reported under the EIA 860 form. We present here data in both AC and DC terms. And the DC terms is here in blue, AC is in red. Many people in the industry prefer the DC connotation, and I'm more familiar with that. So in the year 2017, we have about $1.6 per watt DC. We prefer dollars per watt AC because that facilitates the comparison with other generation technologies a little bit more. And that would be about $2 per watt AC. So it has declined a lot, the prices, over the last years, 60% since 2010. And as you can see in the zoom in on the right side for the year 2017, there's still quite a bit of a spread between prices. Some projects will have relatively high prices, above $3 per watt DC, and that may be a project that is built on a landfill site or has particularly challenging environmental circumstances or has experienced a lot of project delays and maybe old EPC agreements that just date back multiple years, whereas some other projects are priced very, very aggressively around at least 60 cents per watt DC. So that's on the very low end. Overall, this sample is backwards looking and only refers to projects that have come online by the end of the year 2017 and is not reflective of current projects that are being built or coming online in the year 2018-2019, where project prices will have likely come further down. A different way of looking at the prices is looking at the price distribution here with this distribution graph. The 2017 projects are in the blue area, and we have drafted a couple of other years in comparison. What you really can see is that both the median and the mode really shift leftwards towards lower prices each year. And what's also interesting to see is that for the year 2017, the overall price spread is the smallest in comparison to past years, so measures like a standard deviation or so show this clearly, pointing to a reduction really in the underlying heterogeneity of prices across all of the installed projects and potentially more industry maturity. Different way of looking at prices as well is looking at it by technology. So the green bars here are the median prices of all projects, and then we distinguish here again between fixed tilt prices and tracking prices. Historically, tracking projects had higher prices than fixed tilt installations because they require a little bit more machinery, and the overall setup is a little bit more complicated, so they come with a cost premium that we found in our sample over the past years. However, in the year 2017, we actually found that the median price of all fixed tilt installations was higher than the median price of all reported tracking installations. Now, that doesn't mean that for any individual projects, fixed tilt would be more expensive than tracking, but rather that on average, the prices that have been reported among all tracking projects just happens to be a little bit lower. And for example, that could mean that fixed tilt installations are now increasingly just built in regions that may have more challenging design circumstances, for example, different soil conditions or very high wind loads or so. And that would then just increase some of the costs over there. So, take that with a little grain of salt, but I thought that was a fairly interesting observation. Historically, however, this cost premium that we've had for tracking installations is usually outweighed by the increased generation that those tracking projects have. And so on a levelized basis, it makes financial sense, and that's why we really have seen this increasing spread of tracking projects over the years. This graph here divvies up the 2017 projects by the installed project size, and we have 4 different size bins here. And what we can see here is that we have faint evidence really of economies of scale, meaning that larger projects come in a little cheaper. The majority of the projects in our pricing sample really fall into this first category of 5 to 20 megawatts. That's where many of the projects that are out there have been built. And if you then look at the graph, you can see the decreasing green bars as you go to the bigger size categories. And so this is really obvious, even more so if you look at dollars per watt DC, where prices decline from nearly 1.60 dollars per watt DC over 1.45 dollars per watt DC to $135 per watt DC for the 50 to 100 megawatt range. I wouldn't place too much emphasis or attention to the very largest size bin just because of the small sample size that we have there. Last, project prices vary by region, and especially some of the newcomers that we have in our pricing sample or overall in the utility scale solar market, the Midwest and Texas, tend to have lower prices than some of the established players like California. Now, it's important to point out that really the majority of our pricing sample comes from the Southeast, 49 or nearly 50 projects there, whereas in other markets such as California, we have a relatively small sample size. So again, take those data with a grain of salt. California has historically been a little bit of a higher priced region, and that could be driven in part by technology ubiquity. So, they use more tracking projects relative to fixed tilt installations, but other factors may include labor costs or the prominence of union labor or the cost of land, the difficulty of the terrain, soil conditions, snow and wind loads, or maybe just the balance of supply and demand among both components or new developers and work crews, etc. I will conclude this upfront capital cost discussion with a brief comparison between our prices that are all in cost reports with some other estimates from various industry stakeholders who utilize bottom-up price models. And so what we do is we have final transaction price of, I don't know, maybe $20 million or so, and then we look at how big is the project and then come up with a dollar per watt price for this particular project, whereas others who use these bottom-up models track prices for individual components and then stack them up, usually verify them with some interviews with developers or so. But often those prices represent maybe best-in-class prices and not typical prices for all projects across the entire spectrum that are built across the United States. What we see is that our all-in cost reports come in at slightly higher prices in comparison to others, to some extent that may be due to differences in the scope of the model cost. For example, GTM excludes any kind of developer profits or developer overhead. To some extent maybe due to differences in the time indexing, where they may describe projects that are still under development or that are currently negotiated, whereas we look only at projects that have been built online by the end of 2017. But it's interesting to see that our empirical, in quotation marks, prices are coming in a little higher than some of these modeled prices. With that, I now want to shift to operation and maintenance costs. We get operation and maintenance costs from FERC Form 1, and utility scale PV projects that are owned by vertically integrated utilities have to report prices to FERC on this FERC Form 1. The cost here often includes supervision and engineering, maintenance, rents, and training costs, but excludes certain payments for property taxes, insurance, land royalties, performance bonds, or some other administrative fees and overhead. So they don't represent all-in cost. But nevertheless, this is, at least to our knowledge, the only really accessible database for O&M cost that we can analyze. And so we have less projects here in comparison to our overall project sample, only 40 projects totaling about 800 megawatts. And for this limited sample, we see in blue declining average prices in capacity terms in the year 2017. It's about $16 per kilowatt year, or if one uses the generation denomination, that would be about $8.5 per megawatt hour. And the whiskers represent the least and the most expensive utility, and that range has also been narrowing over the course of the years, potentially pointing to further economies of scale. And with this, I'd like to hand it back to Mark.
Okay, thanks, Yo. Before I jump back in, I just want to remind everybody to type any questions you have into the chat or Q&A box, and we will get to those at the end. So I want to turn now to capacity factors. So on this graph, you see cumulative capacity factors for nearly 400 projects totaling 16 gigawatts of AC capacity that was installed over the past decade, going back through 2007. Because we need a full year of data to calculate capacity factors, this sample does not include any projects built in 2017. The sample ends with 2016 projects. As you can see, the overall range in project level capacity factors is quite large, from 14 to 35%, and a good deal of that variation can be explained by the three primary drivers of capacity factor that are broken out on this graph, namely the average quality of the solar resource at the site, whether the project tracks the sun or is mounted at a fixed tilt, and finally the inverter loading ratio that Yo explained earlier. And the relationships here are largely as you'd expect. As you move from left to right, a higher inverter loading ratio typically results in a higher AC capacity factor, and the same holds true when you switch from fixed tilt to tracking, and also when you move from a lower into a higher solar resource bin. There are a few individual outlier projects here and there, and some of that might reflect curtailment of specific projects, which is embedded within these numbers. For those of you who prefer to think in geographic terms rather than in terms of insolation, this graph breaks out the same capacity factor data on a regional basis. The overall rankings shouldn't be too surprising, with the Northeast and Midwest having the lowest capacity factors, while the Southwest and California have the highest. You can also see the tracking provides more of an incremental benefit over fixed tilt in the higher capacity factor regions over on the right, than it does in the lower capacity factor regions on the left, and as a result we see a lot more tracking than fixed tilt projects in those high capacity factor regions, while the reverse holds true for the low capacity factor regions. Okay, this graph breaks out average capacity factor by project vintage or commercial operation date, and you can see a steady improvement from 2010 vintage through 2013 vintage projects, and that was driven by increases in all three of the metrics listed here, whether it's average insolation, the prevalence of tracking, or the average inverter loading ratio. Since 2013, though, we've seen the average inverter loading ratio hold more or less steady at around 1.3, while the two other drivers, tracking and insolation or GHI, those two have kind of moved in opposite directions, resulting in largely stagnant capacity factors among the more recent project vintages. And again, the lower average global horizontal irradiance since 2013 reflects the geographic expansion of the market outside of California and the Southwest that Yo talked about, while the increase in the prevalence of tracking reflects the growing competitiveness of tracking systems, even in those lower insolation regions. Finally, for capacity factors, we've now amassed enough project level data that we can start to look at performance degradation over time. And as you can see here, whether you look at the capacity weighted average or the median line, there definitely seems to have been degradation. The red dashed line here suggests that performance seems to be degrading at an average rate of about 1.25% per year, which is significantly more than is commonly expected. That said, there are a number of important caveats to note, the largest and most important of which is that we have made no attempt yet to weather correct the data for interannual variability in the strength of the solar resource at each site. So it could very well be that some of this apparent degradation is simply reflecting several consecutive summers or years of below normal insolation in the Southwest, for example. Curtailment is also embedded within these numbers, and as we'll see a bit later, curtailment has increased in recent years, at least in California, which is the largest market. And finally, the sample size is not consistent from year to year, or I'm sorry, not just the sample size, but the sample itself is not consistent from year to year. Each year represents a kind of a different collection of projects, and the sample size also kind of drops off rather quickly over time, which reflects the relative youth of the utility scale market. So all of these things could be kind of conspiring together to complicate the picture and make performance degradation appear to be larger than it actually has been. I am happy to say that we will be digging into this issue a little bit more and taking a closer look at degradation rates over the next few years through some work that we'll be doing in partnership with NREL. So hopefully by next year at this time we'll actually have a little more defensible numbers here. Okay, turning now to PPA prices. The combination of lower upfront costs that Yo covered earlier and higher capacity factors that I just covered has enabled PPA prices to fall rather dramatically over time. Each bubble shown on these graphs represents the levelized PPA price from a single contract, with the size of the bubble tied to contract capacity and the location on the graph indicating the levelized price at the date of contract execution. The price levelization calculation takes into account both escalation rates and time of delivery factors if present, and all levelized prices are expressed here in real 2017 dollars. The graph on the left shows our full sample of contracts going back to 2006, while the graph on the right focuses in on just the most recent period starting in 2015. Now, although California and the Southwest dominated the sample through 2013, within the past few years we've seen the market broaden considerably to the other 6 regions that are shown here, most of which are now turning in very competitive PPA prices. For example, if you focus on the graph on the right, you'll see that with a few exceptions, including projects located in Hawaii, many of the more recent PPAs are priced under $40 per megawatt hour, with several as low as just $20 per megawatt hour. Now, 8 of these contracts are not just for solar, but instead are for PV plus long-duration battery storage, and by long duration, I mean 4 to 5 hours. These PV plus storage bubbles are indicated by shading and also by the arrows there on the graph. And as you can see, in general, these contracts do not seem to be priced at all that much of a premium relative to their PV-only counterparts. In fact, the most recent PV plus storage contracts coming out of Nevada, those are the kind of the orange bubbles shown at the far right of the graph. They suggest that the storage adder for a lithium-ion battery that is sized to about 1/4 of the PV project capacity is only about $5 per megawatt hour, which is roughly half of what it was just a year ago. Okay, these two graphs show a clearer picture of the time trend by averaging PPA prices in each year, which are shown here by the columns. The left graph shows the price decline solely by contract execution date, while the right graph shows it both by contract execution date, again, the blue columns, and also commercial operation date, which are the orange columns. Now, obviously, due to the time lag between when a PPA is signed and when the project becomes operational, the orange bars are always trying to kind of catch up with the blue bars. But you can see that the price spread between the orange and blue bars has diminished considerably in recent years as we've really entered this era of very low PPA prices. And it's gotten to the point where there's really not much difference between the two anymore. Let's see. I think I'm going to skip over this one in the interest of time so that we have some time to get to questions. And I'll move on here to this one. In addition to PPA prices, we also collect enough other data about these projects, including both CapEx and capacity factor, which we've already run through. And this enables us to kind of estimate each project's levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. Now, LCOE is typically calculated without the inclusion of incentives like the investment tax credit. So that's what's shown by the blue circles here, and also the orange dash markers, which indicate the median. But we can also estimate LCOE including the impact of the 30% ITC, and that's what's shown by the green dash markers there. And you can see that LCOE, or the median LCOE with the ITC, pretty closely matches the median PPA price, which is shown here by the black line. And that suggests that the market for PPAs has been pretty competitive. Looking ahead, the ongoing decline in PPA prices so far in 2018 suggests that we can expect LCOE to continue to decline as well. And while this ongoing decline in LCOE and PPA prices has made utility-scale PV more competitive with other sources of generation, it's also important to recognize that the wholesale market value of solar in some higher penetration markets like California has been declining at the same time. So these two graphs show largely the same thing, with the only difference being that the left graph is on an annual basis back to 2012, while the right graph is on a quarterly basis back to 2015. In both cases, the dark orange bars show the solar penetration rate within the California ISO market, while the lighter creamy portions of the bars show the rate of solar curtailment. Not surprisingly, as penetration has increased, so too has the rate of curtailment. The blue circles, meanwhile, show solar's value factor, which we've defined here as the wholesale market revenue earned by solar generation divided by the average wholesale power price across all hours. So said another way, given a solar project's hourly generation profile, how much revenue did it earn in the wholesale market over the course of a year relative to a hypothetical baseload plant that's generating at a constant output in all hours of the year? And as you can see, back in 2012, when solar penetration was only about 2% in California, solar earned 126% of the average wholesale power price in that year. But in 2017, last year, with solar penetration at around 15%, solar earned just 79% of the average wholesale power price. And based on data through the first half of this year, this value deflation is likely to continue in 2018 as well. It is worth noting that California is somewhat unique in terms of its high solar penetration rate, and that most other markets throughout the U.S. are not yet grappling with this solar value deflation issue. For example, in ERCOT and SPP, as well as PJM, solar still earned more than the average wholesale power price over the course of 2017. Okay, this table provides some details on 16 utility-scale PV plus battery storage projects that are either online or have been announced. Last year we had only 4 such projects to examine. This year we're at 16, and I suspect that next year there will no doubt be many, many more. There's a lot of interesting data in this table, but I just want to highlight a few things here. First, the battery to PV capacity ratio varies quite a bit, from a low of just 5% all the way up to 150%. And in general, the ratio corresponds to the primary intended use of the battery. So, for example, NextEra's Citrus project, which is the third one listed there, that Florida project is DC coupled, and it's intended to capture what would otherwise be midday clipped energy resulting from a very high inverter loading ratio. I think it's about 1.65. Since the amount of clipped solar energy is generally pretty small, though, the battery capacity is sized to be just 5% of the PV capacity. In contrast, many of the Hawaiian projects have sized the battery capacity to be exactly the same as the PV capacity, because they essentially want all of the midday PV output to go towards charging the battery rather than flowing onto a grid that is already quite saturated with solar. Another trend we noticed is towards retrofitting battery storage at existing PV projects. The IRS issued some guidance earlier this year highlighting the ability to add ITC-eligible storage to PV projects after the fact, and we've since seen several PV project owners take steps towards retrofitting some of their existing projects with batteries. And then finally, I'll just note that the storage element is being compensated within PPAs in several different ways. In some of the earliest projects, the price for storage was simply rolled into the overall energy price on a $1 per megawatt hour basis. More recently, we've seen the storage component compensated separately through a fixed capacity payment. And then in another interesting case, there is no direct compensation for storage within the PPA, but because the PPA price is based on the local nodal price, the project sponsor has an incentive to store solar energy during the low-priced midday hours and then deliver it later in the evening when prices are higher. Similarly, Arizona Public Service has signed a contract in which they'll only pay for energy delivered between the hours of 3 and 8 p.m. So there is some interesting innovation happening contractually in these early days of PV plus storage. Okay, as I mentioned, in the interest of time, we are not going to run through CSP here, though we're happy to talk about it during the Q&A if anyone has questions. So instead, I'm just going to kind of quickly wrap this up here with a bit of a look forward. So at the end of 2017, there were a whopping 188 gigawatts of solar making its way through the major interconnection queues across the country. And more than half of that amount first entered the queues in 2017, so it's pretty significant growth. As you can see in the main graph here, this strong showing moves solar into first place ahead of both wind and natural gas in terms of total capacity in the queues. And this graph, I think, clearly demonstrates that we are moving towards a solar, wind, and gas world with a growing amount of storage sprinkled in as well. And this is obviously a very different picture than what we saw just a few years ago. Meanwhile, the inset graph shows that the 188 gigawatts of solar in these queues is broadly distributed throughout the country, with strong growth exhibited in just about every region. And in particular, in the Midwest region, which jumped from 6th place at the end of 2016 to what is essentially a tie for second place at the end of 2017. Now, of course, not all of these projects will ultimately be built as planned. Being in the queues is a necessary step towards, but certainly does not guarantee project completion. But even so, the amount of solar suggested by these graphs is still, pretty astounding, and the broadening distribution of projects throughout the country speaks to solar's increasing maturity and competitiveness in almost every region. So with that, I'd like to once again thank the U.S. Department of Energy Solar Energy Technologies Office for supporting this work. And now it looks like we have at least 10 minutes or so for some questions. So, Yo, let me turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. If you have any kind of question, please feel free to submit them via the Q&A box. We are going to try to answer as many of them as possible. If we don't get to your particular question, we'll make an effort to reach out to you afterwards and send you an email with our potential insights on your question. Before I dive into any particular question, I wanted to just highlight that the report was released last week and is available for free on our project page, which is utilityscalesolar, all one word, .lbl.gov. There you can download a full version of the technical report that has many more details on the content that we covered here today. As well, on that website, you have all the slides that we presented today and an Excel book with underlying data. And in addition to that, you also find some interactive data visualizations where you can play with some of the data that we've presented here yourself and try to get some more insights there. So utilityscalesolar.lbl.gov, there you can find this particular report, other solar work, and on that website as well is a button to sign up for emails about future publications if you are interested. Regarding the questions that we've received so far, one that I'm just going to take real quick is about the ITC. I had mentioned relatively quickly in the beginning that the ITC was extended but was previously set to expire in the year 2016, which is why we had seen this big capacity build-out rush in the year 2016 where people were eager to capture that 30% investment tax credit. And since then it has been extended. It originally was extended until 2020. And since then there have been a few changes, so it's not just like falling off in 2020, but actually ramping down gradually. In the year 2020 it's 26%, then in 2021 it's 22%, and in 2022 it falls to 10% and will remain at 10% of the upfront capital cost for the foreseeable future. Now, the IRS also has issued a so-called safe harbor guidance that if you have made what they call a substantial investment of about 5% or so in any year, you can lock in the ITC at that particular year and have them until the year 2023 to actually complete the project. A question that is somewhat related to that maybe is the potential effects of the tariff that we've seen on project prices so far in our sample, and up until the year 2017, we have not really seen a whole lot of that, given that they were really announced by the end of or in the beginning of 2018, I think. Of course, there was quite a bit of uncertainty during the year of 2017, but given that we only focus on projects that were fully completed by the end of the year of 2017, they have been in development way before any kind of tariff discussion, and so we don't think that the tariff has really factored in here substantially. We may see some effect now in the year 2018, although that could potentially be compensated by the sharply declining module prices after the policy changes that have been announced in China. So maybe that is kind of compensating it, and I guess GTM has recently announced that they've seen a broad uptick in announcement now for future projects, so maybe the effect is not quite as dramatic as originally feared. One other question was whether or not the content that we've covered here so far also applies to community solar projects. although that person was not quite sure how community scale solar is really defined. And I think there's a little bit of confusion in general. There are many different business models there. In general, we only focus here on projects that are larger than 5 megawatts AC. In some regions of the country, community solar is that big. In Minnesota, in particular, we have several projects, so our data there applies. In California, in the Bay Area, we have a CCA that recently built their first project there, so that may apply as well to the community solar there. But many of the projects are smaller than 5 megawatts AC, and those project characteristics would be covered by our companion report, Tracking the Sun, that focuses on projects that are smaller than 5 megawatts AC. Mark, I'm not sure whether you've had time to already look at some of the questions.
Sure, I can take one or two. So somebody asked about whether we had any comments on the effects on performance degradation of environmental factors like pollution or climate change. And soiling is definitely an issue in some areas, and I know that most degradation models and analysis does include a soiling component, and that's why you see workers out cleaning modules every so often to mitigate that effect. During the recent summer wildfire season in California and other places out west in particular, there were days when the smoke and the haze would impact performance somewhat. So it's definitely a factor. But beyond those general comments that I just made, we as I sort of hinted at during the presentation, we haven't taken an in-depth look at degradation yet. It's something we'll be getting to in the next year or so. Someone else asked about how much curtailment there's been in California, and I did show that in one of my slides. I think in the most recent year it was a little bit less than 2%, maybe 1.5% or something like that. The trend in over time has been up. There has been an increase in curtailment as solar penetration has increased. One mitigating factor has been the Western Energy Imbalance Market, which has enabled other states throughout the West to kind of take on some of that solar generation during the midday period when there's too much of it in California. So that's helped to kind of keep a lid on curtailment. Let's see. Someone else asked whether the storage table was based entirely on lithium ion or whether there are other technologies embedded in that slide. To date, we've only seen lithium ion batteries deployed. We haven't seen flow batteries, or at least don't have any stats on those so far. I think those are probably coming down the road, but so far the market has been primarily lithium ion.
Okay, Mark, maybe I'll take over with
sure.
one or two other questions. One asked, what are the incremental effects of tracking in terms of generation boosts? And it really depends a lot on the solar resource environment that you have. If you don't have that much sun to begin with, tracking that little amount of sun over the course of the day gives you less of a generation boost than if you are in California where you have a lot of sun and you really get a lot more of a premium out there. But it was shown on one of the slides as well. I think in California it's nearly 5% of a benefit relative to a fixed hold installation, whereas in some other areas that is less, about maybe 1 or 2% of an increment, which explains why we have seen tracking technology to be built out first in the solar-rich regions, and only with the decline in tracking prices that has spread to other areas. If you're really interested in that, we've done a regression analysis on that 1 or 2 years ago, which you can find on our website. One other question was in the PPA slide whether we include any other upfront incentives or incentives there beyond the ITC. Mark can probably explain that a little bit more, but we have, in addition to the ITC, the accelerated depreciation schedule, which makes it a little bit more beneficial for a sponsor, and then there may be additional state incentives in some areas that could be captured by the PPA sponsor as well.
Yeah, that's right. I don't really have anything else to add to that one. Someone did ask about CSP, and since I sort of promised that we would talk about that a little if people asked, I guess I'd like to address that one. This person was kind of wondering what the main message of the CSP slides was. And so I guess in a very quick nutshell, there really hasn't been any new CSP project brought online in the U.S. Since I think 2015 was the last one. There was sort of a burst of developments with projects coming online between 2013 and 2015. And some of those projects represented new technology like power tower technology with thermal energy storage. And I guess the overall message in the CSP section of our report is that CSP has kind of struggled to compete with PV on upfront costs, and as a result, there really aren't any new CSP projects in later stages of development within the U.S., although overseas the technology does continue to make some progress. And I guess maybe a secondary message would be that some of those existing projects that came online over the past 5 years or so have had a little bit of have struggled a little bit to kind of reach their performance targets for one reason or another. So the market has pretty clearly moved, at least in the U.S., towards PV. CSP does have the benefit of embedded thermal storage if they set it up that way, and as solar penetration increases, that could be a useful asset in the future. So we may see more CSP down the road, but for the time being, it's mostly PV. Yo?
Yeah, just to follow on that CSP topic, there was one person asking about what the heck does this yellow line mean, which I glanced over when I reported the operation and maintenance cost. So that is the only CSP project that is actually owned by utility, and that's an older project owned by Florida Power and Light. And it's a little bit more difficult to compare those costs directly because they may include natural gas that is used to co-fire the facility to get it up to operating temperatures in the morning. But at least in the recent year, we've seen higher costs there for nearly $70 a kilowatt year.
Yeah, okay, so another one that came in, someone asked about if I could explain a little more about the PV plus storage contract in Arizona. I guess this is the APS First Solar project where APS will only pay for output, I think, between 3 and 8 p.m. And so what that means is that the project is set up to kind of store all of the solar generation prior to 3 p.m. and then discharge it back to the grid during that 3 to 8 p.m. window. And APS set it up that way is because, like California, they're kind of experiencing their own duck curve with too much midday solar generation. So they structured that PPA in a way to address their needs, which is power later in the day when load starts to ramp up. So, yeah, that's that one. Yo, are you seeing any more? We are approaching the top of the hour here, so maybe one or two more, if there are any.
Yeah, maybe one brief question was whether we're tracking or not the development time that it takes between project announcement or land acquisition and final commercial operation date. We're currently not doing that. It's difficult to get consistent data on that for all projects, so we've not looked at that into detail. And another question was whether or not there are big cost differences between low voltage and high voltage systems. And I'm not sure so much whether it depends on the voltage, but project size in general, smaller scale installations that are smaller than 5 megawatts AC typically have higher upfront costs. Just because they are often installed maybe on more difficult terrain or cannot fully capture the economies of scale that are partly evident here among utility scale solar projects. And with that, we are, I think, at the top of the hour, and I thank you very much for your attention and the time that you have spent with us here today. We will put up the recording of this webinar probably by the end of today or tomorrow. The slides are already available on our website, and you can sign up there in order to hear from new publications from us as well if you're interested. And yeah, thank you very much, and I hope you have a good day.